Welcome back to the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. I am your host, Garret Price, and I'm here with the legend in the space, JJ Zachariason at Late Round Quarterback. JJ, how you doing, man?
I'm good. I was telling you before we started, a little under the weather today. So if I have any horrendous takes, that's my excuse.
Hey, that's a perfect excuse. Like, look, my mind wasn't fully there, I'm on some stuff, some medicine right now. I'm a little loopy.
Right.
I should just do that all the time, honestly.
I know. Honestly, I probably should too.
Well, today we're going to be covering the 2025 class, kind of more of an overview look. We'll get into maybe some specifics, but we're just going to kind of do an overview on this 2025 rookie class. And we know that JJ is one of, if not the best source of information when it comes to how a class or how players look from a model's perspective and analytically. And then we'll kind of like compare and contrast that with some film takes and how things look. Now, JJ, I know that this running back class has kind of been the belle of the ball. It's the one that everybody's been talking about. I know from a film perspective, I have some pretty impressive grades on a lot of players in this class. But from your perspective, is it just an okay class, a good class, a great class, a legendary? Like how would you kind of rank this class compared to what we've seen over the past 10 years or so?
Yeah, I within my my running back model at this point, the only input from a production standpoint, and this is gonna sound kind of insane to some people, but the only inputs from a production standpoint at this time are receiving related. So some might say, well, how are you going to capture what you need with running backs on the ground and what they do, in the ground game? And the answer to that is, well, number one, draft capital is an input within the prospect model that I use. It's called the ZAP model. Draft capital is part of that. That usually captures the rushing portion enough. And then there's also some things like size, right? So like a running back size matters to a degree and such. So when I look at it through the lens of what the ZAP model is saying, the only class that sort of like, if I look at breakout score, which is a metric I use that I created that's based on receiving yards per team pass attempt, it's adjusted for both program strength and for age adjusted production. When you look at it from that lens, when you look at it from a reception share lens, which is the other main production metric at running back, this class really is the second or best class that we've seen since 2011, right there with 2017. So 2017, the thing that's interesting though with 2017, we didn't see anything really funky happen that year when it comes to draft capital, like pretty standard, like number of day 2 picks and such. We just had a lot of them hit, the round 1 guys hit, and then some guys on day 3, like the Aaron Jones types, they ended up hitting as well. I think that we're looking at a class that's at least as talented as the 2017 one. And as we know, that 2017 one, we still got dudes kicking it today. I mean, they're still crushing it today. So I think it is, a 9.5 out of 10 type class. If not, if you want to look at it over the last 10 years or so, I mean, we could call it 10 out of 10. I mean, it's a really, really good and deep class.
No, and from a film perspective, I think we see it pretty similar. When I look now, I've been maybe not going quite as long. So this is the 6th year kind of doing what we call our nerd score. And that basically puts numerical grades on attributes for players pre-draft to make sure, because one of the things that I always struggled with beforehand is us film guys would be like, well, I really like a guy. Well, how much do you like him? Well, I really like him.
Right.
Okay. How do we quantify that?
Right.
And so we kind of put numbers to what we say and do before the draft. And so that way we can be held accountable for some of these things. And so when I look at the numbers that I gave just based on tape, this has nothing to do, obviously, we don't know draft capital. We can speculate, but we don't know draft capital yet. We don't know landing spot yet. We don't know a few of these things, but just on tape alone, when you just look at the top 5 guys, the highest score I gave was Bijan Robinson. He has the highest score. Second highest, Ashton Genty. Third highest would be J.K. Dobbins. Then fourth highest is Travion Henderson. Fifth highest, Omarion Hampton. So I have 3 of the top 5 guys pre-draft score that I've had over the past 6 years. So to have 3 in one class does feel pretty absurd. And even looking at, going down, guys that I would have ranked around running back 5, running back 6, as far as what a normal score was for me in most classes, are running back 12 and 13 in this class. So that's the ridiculous part, is you have the high end guys where we're expecting some fairly elite production. And then we also have pretty darn good depth all the way through as well. So I think this will be one of the more fascinating drafts for me to see, how do these teams kind of value these guys? Do they move up to get some of the elite tier guys, or do they wait a little longer because there's so much depth? Like, I'm really curious how all that's going to play out. How do you think that's going to end up?
I get the question all the time where folks are like, if it's a really deep class like this does that mean that, because again, draft capital is an input. And then, pre-draft, I'm using projected draft capital from places like NFL Mock Draft Database. And so, and there's actually a pretty decent correlation, like we don't do a terrible job as a consensus projecting where these guys are going to go. And there's actually some really interesting data, especially a wide receiver, where like if a team reaches based on mock draft data, like that's a really, really big red flag for that particular player and stuff. So it's pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, like the question that I frequently get is, if it's a deep class, does that mean that the draft capital for some of the higher end guys will just naturally be a little bit lower because teams are waiting, right? Because they're like, oh, I don't need to get Ashton Genty, Amarian Hampton, Travion Henderson, whomever, because I can just wait until day 2, round 3, maybe even into round 4, and get a really high quality back. Everything that I've looked at doesn't necessarily point to that being a thing, So I think that teams just kind of like I think we almost overthink how teams think about the draft. Oftentimes it's just, hey, we have a big board. We've done a lot of evaluating, and this is the way that we rank these players. And then obviously there's an intersection of need and want, with that big board, however they are looking at all these guys. So for a lot of teams, obviously they're going to naturally like devalue the running back position a little bit or what have you from a financial perspective and from the true impact that player, might make on a football field. But at the end of the day, there's still going to be a handful of teams that don't, number one, don't do that. And number two, that see Ashton Genty as a, top 10 player in this draft. And if they're drafting in the top 10, then they're going to say, I'm going to get Ashton Genty because I don't want to miss on this guy, I try not to be influenced too much by, the depth of the class, or, in the reverse, like last year we didn't have any depth, within the class, or you could argue there was just nothing in that class. Right.
Sure.
But it's to me, I think, over the long term and over the long run, you're going to see guys go where they generally are going to be valued and where they should be going.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Are there a couple guys in this running back class that maybe aren't traditionally talked about as, higher end guys, but you're looking at them like, man, they just pop for me. Like, I could see myself maybe having a heavier exposure to these players because I just think that they are a much more solid prospect than maybe the general community thinks of them.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of like potential day 2 guys who may or may not, or at least have a pretty wide range of outcomes that if those guys fall into round 3 or even late round 2 in like a super flex draft, a rookie draft or something, I'm willing to just say, look, I'm just shooting for ceiling. 2 guys that come to mind that sort of fit that archetype would be like a Bhayshul Tuten, who I think, his analytical comps range from like Darrington Evans on the low side to Kenneth Walker on the high side. Someone who is that home run hitter, can play all 3 phases, can't play both phases. Wouldn't be playing defense and special teams. That's where the brain fog from being sick comes into play.
All good.
The ability to catch passes out of the backfield, the ability to handle a big workload. Like I said, a big home run hitting ability for Tuten. But again, it could go south too, because he does have some inconsistencies with his running, which isn't like totally unlike Walker. Walker was someone who, and is someone in the NFL who, you have to take the good with the bad, where he oftentimes, people dismiss like kind of the inconsistencies and the stuff rates and stuff from Walker because he is able to create those massive plays. So like, I think Tuten, like I like Tuten even before the combine happened. And then obviously he runs a crazy 40. And now you kind of are crossing your fingers that he's able to go day 2. I just think there's a lot of running backs that are so questionable to get drafted in round 2 or 3. Whereas, you mentioned the five, like, there's a very solid group that we feel pretty comfortable with. And then there's just a lot of guys. Another one would be DJ Giddens, who I think, again,
I'm with you,
just like a massive range of outcomes here with Giddens, where you can see what he can do. And I talked to Matt Waldman recently. I actually talked to Jagger May, who's coming on my podcast, dropping tomorrow. And they both were very consistent in the way they talked about Giddens, where once he gets in the open field, it's like game over with Giddens. And once he's able to get past the line, it's great. It's just, he's a little bit inconsistent, rush to rush, but the athleticism is crazy. And I feel like the only reason that he's not getting a little bit more love is because this running back class is so good, and so many running backs had really good combines and crazy athleticism. But if you want to like dig even deeper, like probably a lock to be day 3, if not maybe go undrafted, just because there's so much up in the air at the running back position with it being so deep. Jarquez Hunter is probably my favorite dart throw running back right now. He, again, I use breakout score at both running back and wide receiver within my model, and it's both based on receiving yards per team pass attempt. Now, obviously that makes a lot more sense intuitively at wide receiver than it does running back, but it does get good signal at running back. Now, a lot of people, going back to what I said earlier, how there's only receiving metrics and production metrics at the running back position in the model. People are like, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Well, at the end of the day, I'm measuring against PPR output. And what this basically is saying and telling me is that a lot of the rushing stuff, like I said, is going to be captured in draft capital. But we as fantasy managers care a lot more about receiving than even NFL teams do, because it just matters so much to how these guys score points, especially in a PPR environment. Now, Jarquez Hunter wasn't some high volume receiver, but when he did touch the ball through the air, he did a lot. Like he was able to gain a lot of yards, and he did that at a young age. And so his breakout score is actually 93.8, which is a really high score. That's I think it's top 3 in the class. And then his reception share was still okay enough. It was like 10.7% in his best season. But if you look at Hunter compared to the rest of the draft class, he was 5th in career avoided tackles per rush. He was 9th in career explosive run rate. He was 9th in career yards after contact per attempt. I mean, that's within a class that's loaded, that's stacked. And not a lot of people are really talking about Hunter. He had a good combine, maybe a little bit undersized, and that's where the concern would come into play. Maybe he's more like Chase Edmonds than he is someone who's going to, really carry a huge workload, maybe only carry that big workload when there's an injury or when he has to be called upon like that. But, beggars can't be choosers when we're talking about day 3 picks. There's only going to be one or two of them more than likely that really break out even within this class. So Hunter's one guy that I've been keeping an eye on.
No, I like that. And when you're at that point in the draft, honestly, anywhere after like mid round 2 of my, rookie drafts, I just care about ceiling. Like, is there a ceiling path here? Because we know there's so much opportunity for these guys' value just to get destroyed and very quickly. Last guy I want to ask you about in this running back class, and I know you mentioned a lot with the receiving work. I'm a very big fan of this guy. Now, you don't have to be nice if you don't like him. It's totally fine. I'll cry a little bit afterward. But LeQuint Allen, I'm a big LeQuint Allen fan. Really like him as a player. Liked what I saw on tape. Obviously, some really big receiving upside, put up monster yardage there for Syracuse, but also found the end zone quite a bit for somebody that's a little bit undersized, has some room to fill out. So what do you think of a guy like LeQuint Allen?
Yeah, I mean, the model loves him because of the receiving stuff that you're talking about. I mean, he arguably, he probably has a top 2 or 3 receiving profile in the class. So that's obviously good. He wasn't great. He was a little below average at avoiding, tackles and such and breaking tackles. His yard after contact per attempt was below average compared to the rest of the class. But this is a situation, I think, with Allen where you can foresee a situation where a team takes him day 3, which I think he's probably going to be a day 3 guy. The other thing we don't know, I don't think he's tested at pro day yet either, but we don't know exactly, the metric I care about is 40 time, because weight adjusted 40 time does go into the model. Speed score does get some signal at running back. I don't know if he would be so bad to hit the low threshold that I'd be concerned about with him, but I don't know if he has the, crazy upside of like a Giddens or a Tuten or something from a speed score perspective. So I think there's a little bit of that. But if a team is willing to, use him as to start as their satellite back, I think that he could be that third down, that pass catching back plus, right? So some of the comps that were some of the analytical comps for Allen were guys like Kenneth Gainwell, Tyron Tracy, Players who had pretty robust receiving profiles in college. And, maybe we're concerned about their long-term potential to be true bell cows. I mean, obviously, Tracy had a little bit of work last year, but I think that was mostly, out of necessity and not necessarily like this dude is unbelievable. And I love Tracy coming out, but it's just to be a little bit realistic about it. So I think I like Allen for sure. He's someone that I think should be on people's radars, because when you have a trait, when you have a thing that you can sort of latch onto as a day 3 back and a day 3 player, then there's an opportunity to find the field. And if you find the field, then a lot more can come from that.
Absolutely. Let's bounce over to the wide receivers. So for as much love as there's been at the running back position, there's been maybe not quite equal level of dislike, but there's definitely not as much love in the wide receiver class as what we've gotten over the past 2, 3, 4 seasons, where we've had a lot of really, really good prospects. Now, for this argument, we're going to say that Travis Hunter is a part of this class.
Okay.
I know that's part of the argument as to whether the class is good or not, is if Travis Hunter is part of it. So for our purposes here today, we're going to assume he is. We'll find out here very soon whether or not he's going to be playing a lot of wide receiver. That being said, how do you feel about this class overall at the wide receiver position compared to what we've seen over the past decade?
I think with the class, there is some upside in there. Like, there's some players that I can see a path to them being pretty relevant. My thing though is I don't know if there's a ton of safety with a lot of these guys. I mean, even like, I know this is going to sound like a hot take, but I'm gonna just explain this away a little bit. But like Travis Hunter, for instance, okay. When I looked at him analytically, it did not look that great compared to other first round wide receivers historically. Now, I've explained this away, so don't like walk away from this episode thinking that I don't like Travis Hunter. It's very difficult, I think, for analytics to fully pick up on not only the situation that he was in at Colorado, but the fact that he played like 90 snaps a game. He's not prepping the same way that most wide receivers would prep, all that kind of stuff. And the other thing too is like, if you look at his like best season in yards per route run, it's like a 15th, 16th percentile number compared to, other wide receivers that we've seen drafted in the first round over the last decade and a half. Now, in that offense, though, you're seeing a lot of 4 wide sets. You're seeing it's a situation where when there's more competition on the field, a metric like yards per route run can be lowered a little bit. It's part of the reason why like a Drake London in year 1 in the NFL, had a little bit of a boosted yards per route run rate, because they used a lot of 2 tight end sets and a lot of 2 wide receiver sets, which allowed him to face easier competition on his own team to then get force-fed the ball a little bit more. So we have to keep all of that in mind. And this is why I use the model as a guide. It's not the end all. It's just a way for me to be like, okay, don't get too high or too low on these guys and try to be realistic. So with Travis Hunter, it's a totally, unique situation that I can subjectively throw in there and be fine with doing that. His score at the end of the day, even with really, really high draft capital, is probably going to align with a couple of other guys in this class. He's still part of like the top, elite producer tier or what have you, but that's admittedly driven almost entirely by top 5 draft capital, Right. And so I say that there's not a lot of safety in this class. I think Hunter is relatively safe if he were only to play wide receiver. We obviously know that might not fully come to fruition. Correct. But then also, I do think there are at least some analytical concerns, not because I think that he's incapable. It's just that we didn't fully see what he would be like as an only full-time wide receiver. And I think that's impacting his score a little bit.
No, that makes sense. From an overall film perspective, if Hunter was not in the class, the wide receiver 1 in this class would be the lowest wide receiver score that I've given to the top receiver in the class over the past 6 seasons. So we know kind of that top end talent is not quite there. Hunter kind of helped make up for that a little bit. But one guy that I had some concerns with when watching his tape, and I'm kind of curious to see how things kind of played out for you, because there's part of me that sees, wow, I mean, this guy has some really special movement skills, but there's a lot of red flags, and watching his tape surprisingly reminded me, like, I couldn't put my finger on it at first. I was like, what player does this remind me of? And so I'm racking my brain. I'm like, man, I hope it's somebody good. I hope it's somebody good. And then I finally like clicked and I was like, this film looks so much like Jalen Reagor. And that was Luther Burden. And so I'm curious to see, how did Burden kind of work out in your model?
So the model loves Burden. I think there are more subjective concerns to his profile. I actually wrote this up in a newsletter last week, but Burden, if you look at his usage, slot usage, a lot of slot usage, a lot of targets behind the line of scrimmage, a lot of short area targets. He did get down the field, a relatively okay amount, but a lot of that was out of the slot too. So it wasn't just like perimeter work. Right. But the problem with, so I'll give you the bowl argument and why the model looks at him favorably. If you look analytically at any of these wide receivers and their top seasons in college, I would argue that Luther Burden's season, his sophomore season, analytically is the best age-adjusted production season of anyone in this class. It is phenomenal. And so his breakout score, which is receiving yards per team pass attempt, which gets adjusted for age, and then also gets adjusted for program strength. So, if you're playing SEC. If you're playing at with Isaac Tesla's playing at Hillsdale College to start his career, he's getting dinged a pretty decent bit for playing at Hillsdale College. Whereas, Luther Burden is playing against some pretty big programs and he's still, compiling the numbers he's compiling. Now, in the model, it doesn't look at alignment and the concerns that I would have more subjectively, because if you were to here's a player that, from a usage perspective, I don't think that he's a strong comp because body composition wise, I think the way they move is a little bit different. But the analytical comp from a usage perspective is Wan'Dale Robinson. Luther Burden was used almost identically throughout college as the way that Wan'Dale Robinson was used. And you could even say this archetype is like a Paris Campbell, the players that have not done well throughout their NFL careers. There's definitely a lot of question marks. Wan'Dale Robinson of the guys that I can't remember the other ones, but Wan'Dale Robinson of the guys that he sort of comped to usage wise was probably the best outcome. Now, with that being said, Luther Burden, when given an opportunity to play on the perimeter, his numbers don't look that bad. They're not fantastic, but they're not far off from like a Tet McMillan in terms of like yards per route run, playing and lining up on the outside. If I look at it strictly from the model's perspective and filter, like the way that comps are built is size wise and production wise, so it's breakout score related in the ZAP model. He gets comps of DJ Moore, Brandon Ayuk was another one, which the Ayuk one's kind of interesting. I had Matt Waldman on my show last week, and his top comp for Luther Burden was also Brandon Ayuk, and it hasn't been thrown around that much. But if you think about the narrative of these guys coming into the league, both yak players, right? Both guys that can do a lot once the ball's in their hands, but there's a lot of question marks about how they do against man and how crisp their route running is. Are they going to be able to play a standard receiver position? And I just remembered another one of the guys was like a Kadarius Toney type that Burden kind of played with or played alike. But with Ayuk, he's obviously become a very good wide receiver and he got paid and he, has fulfilled what the 49ers, wanted him to be. We don't know if Burden's going to necessarily get there, but I do think the opportunity and the potential is at least there. The DJ Moore comp, I don't think is really as strong just because Moore was mostly a perimeter guy in college whenever he was coming out. Sure. And I think that he was just a safer bet at wide receiver than Burden is. But yeah, I mean, Burden's just one of those guys where, like I said, I think the ceiling is there for him if he finds a team that understands his skill set and can deploy him in a way that I don't think has to be identical to how they did it at Mizzou, because that's not really a thing that we see at the NFL level. But I think at the very least he can play slot. Is that someone that you want to invest a mid first to late first round rookie pick in? Maybe not. I do think though that if you're looking strictly at wide receiver, I can poke holes in basically every wide receiver's profile in this class. So Burden to me is sort of like, I understand anyone's true argument, for or against him. It's a tough evaluation. I think that he's probably one of the toughest ones, in this class.
I could not agree more. I think there are a lot of really difficult evals in this wide receiver class. And honestly, that's what it feels like. It's just littered with boom bust picks. The only guy from a film perspective that I feel has a safe floor is Emeka Egbuka. Mm-hmm. That's really the only one from a film perspective of like, he fits in almost any offense. Yeah. He can play all three wide receiver positions. There's just a lot of solidness to his game, but he doesn't necessarily have nearly the ceiling that maybe a couple of the other guys in the class have. So that's where it gets a little tricky.
Yeah, 100%. Like to me, like Egbuka is, in that sort of Robert Woods mold and archetype, which is fine, especially if you can find that kind of landing spot and that kind of situation. You know, Woods, like people forget that Woods wasn't Woods until he got to LA and was able to really
he was tough in
shine in
Buffalo.
that offense. He was
great.
good, but he wasn't what he became. So I do think that Egbuka is safe. He could fit anywhere, but I think from like a fantasy and production standpoint, he's going to be someone that probably still needs to be in that good environment in order to thrive.
Absolutely. Give me one or two guys that you're like, yeah, I don't hear these guys talked about the difference makers in the class, but for me, they're gonna score pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, one guy is definitely Jalen Knoll. I know that he's been getting a lot more love, and he's probably going to be a day 2 pick at this point. But you know, I like to look at so one of the inputs in the model at wide receiver is rushing production. It's not that I want a guy to have 700 rushing yards. It's just to show, did he hit some, you know, lower thresholds like 100 yards, 105 yards, etc. You know, did he get to that point throughout his collegiate career? Because there is some signal that brings, and you might be wondering, why does that matter? It's also not fair to a player like Tet McMillan or whomever, who's sort of a little, you know, bigger, isn't going to see necessarily as many end arounds and such, but it does signal talent, right? It tells us that that scheme, that coaching staff is trying to get that player, you know, the ball and get it in his hands. And that's a signal of talent. And special teams is another thing where, you know, like Buka is another one of those guys who had that rushing and special teams work. Luther Burden had rushing work. But Jalen Knoll is another special teams / you know, rusher who got some work on the ground. And really all of his receiving metrics are basically like above average compared to the rest of the class. So like everything is really, really solid analytically for Knoll. And then you look kind of deeper and you see that there's a season where his ADOT was only like 2.7 yards out of the slot, you know, and then, you know, last year he actually had more deep targets than Jaden Higgins had in the same offense. You see him compete with an NFL caliber player in Jaden Higgins and still be able to see, you know, enough work in that offense, which is a good sign. I just think there's a lot to like. His top comp within the model. Now, again, I like to be realistic with comp. So the bottom end is like a Devin Duvernay type or like a Sky Moore type, but the higher end is a Randall Cobb. Like I think that he could be, you know, that impressive of a player at the next level. He's someone that I'm definitely keeping an eye on.
No, I like that quite a bit. He reminded me a little bit of Golden Tate on tape.
Yep.
So yeah, I could totally see that. And he's fighting actually with Luther Burden for my 6th spot. They are neck and neck at the moment in the class. So we didn't get as much time to talk about quarterback and tight end. I don't want to keep you too long. Any just sweeping thoughts on the class? You know, obviously we've got 2 good tight ends. We've got 1 to 3 good quarterbacks, depending on who you talk to. Any just overarching feelings on either of those positions?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I do have a tight end model. I don't have a quarterback model just because it's so freaking difficult to prospect analytically with those guys, because so much of it is just between the ears and whatnot. I can say, you know, from a tight end modeling perspective, it's a solid class. I think there's a chance that we get, you know, those again, Tyler Warren and Colson Loveland both look really good in the model. But when I say really good, it's not Brock Bowers good. It's more like, you know, the model really likes Sam Laporta when he came out. It's a little bit worse than Sam Laporta is the way that it's viewing those players at this point, which is not a bad thing whatsoever. I think both of them are going to be, you know, if I were to like label them as something at the, you know, maybe like mid-range tight end to low end tight end ones, you know, the first few years of their career, and then maybe one of them can end up hitting. It liked Harold Fannin a decent bit just because of the production until the combine happened. That slow 40, you know, we can explain it away that that's not the game that he plays, but at the same time, there is even more so at tight end than the other positions. That speed score does get a decent amount of correlation. So I'm actually the one guy that I'm probably most interested in would be Terrence Ferguson, you know, out of Oregon, just because his athletic, his production metrics were fine. They weren't anything spectacular, but he crushed the combine. And it was an overall kind of disappointing combine for the tight ends because we didn't see the higher end guys test. And then, you know, guys like Fannin and others weren't necessarily as fast as we wanted them to be. Ferguson was that dude who kind of stood out, you know, at the combine as that athletic type that translates very well to fantasy football. So I'll be curious to see what his draft capital looks like. Because right now, I think that he's right there in the discussion with like an Elijah Arroyo or like, you know, I know a lot of people like Mason Taylor, like strictly from a, you know, this is trying to predict fantasy football. Tight ends a little bit difficult because these dudes are offensive line extensions and, you know, teams are going to want to use them in a lot of different ways. But I do think Ferguson sort of fits the mold of the kind of game breaking, tight end that we would want, from a fantasy perspective.
Awesome. Well, JJ, I appreciate you coming on here so much, joining us. Anything right now that you have going on that you're like, hey, this is pretty dope, you better check this out?
Yeah, I mean, the Late Round podcast, you can find anywhere podcasts can be found. I'm doing that all the time. And then also the Late Round Prospect Guide. I published that back in March. It's going to be updated once the NFL draft is over. So if you guys want, just straight analytical takes, little dad humor in there, check it out. It's 160 pages long. I'll be updating that the night of the final day of the NFL draft. So it'll be out and you'll be ready for your rookie drafts. But that's all on lateround.com.
Awesome. Well, JJ, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you guys for watching, tuning in. We've got tons more draft content. We've got videos coming out daily. Make sure you stay tuned right here, leading all the way up to the draft.